We're going to start this video today with the definition of Homo sapien. Most people don't realize that definition is debated today and has historically been debated. And it was only recently, say after 1950s, for example, that the definition of Homo sapien was separated from the 4-foot mute hairy wild man, which included the orangutan, chimpanzee, and gorilla. Previously, now when this was first defined in about 1789 or so by Carl Linné in this book, Systems of Nature, he separated the wild man, American, that's like Native American, European, Asiatic, that's Mongoloid or Asian, and then African, we call that Black or Negroid. And so these were all considered varieties of Homo sapien, which I believe is actually still the most accurate definition of Homo sapien. And when you go through to trace the changes to the definition of Homo sapiens, what you find is layers and layers of new terminologies, new layers of classification. And it becomes, at least it became apparent to me, that there were some deviations from the classification system for Homo sapien, that it is not treated consistently with other taxonomic systems. And for example, phenotypes, or the way something looks, size, shape, color, these sorts of attributes are called phenotypes. And we use these phenotypes to classify species, whether it's bacteria, plants, or animals. And there is some inconsistency with the definition of Homo sapien in terms of its classification. And that it became quite obvious that it's not treated the same way other species are in the taxonomic system. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about classifying Homo sapiens. And so we know that, for example, Coco the gorilla and various chimpanzees who have been studied by psychologists show that they have an IQ of about 85. And the reason that's important is it's quite in line with other Homo sapiens, other varieties of Homo sapiens like Negroids, and quite a lot of Asiatic populations as well. And so I would personally argue, and currently this is Australopithecus afarensis, for example, this is a consistent morphology or bone structure with a pygmy. Both of those were found in Ethiopia around the same location. The Australopithecus afarensis is dated to about 3.2 million years old. But so I would argue that within the Negroid population, we have different species. And that is supported by the evidence that archaic Homo species, or pan-ancestors, are alive and well today in Africa as intermediate hybrids between apes, gorillas, and humans. And so because the taxonomic system treats them as different species, I do believe that's accurate, but they are also classified as non-human species. Anyway, my point is that anytime we have a bell curve, you're going to have natural deviation within that bell curve. And that's normal for a population of species. But when you have deviations in that bell curve like these two, that's an indication that you've got a couple of different samples here, and you need to separate this data to see if it is more appropriate to class in its own category. So we can see this deviation from the Caucasian IQ bell curve, and we can also see this deviation within the Black IQ bell curve. So that's an indication that these are actually separate species. We're going to go ahead and move on to the taxonomic system for archaic Homo species. So basically this is just saying that this is where humans evolved from. It's actually incorrect because it does look like the preponderance of evidence is actually on multi-regional evolution and not on gradualism. It's also important to know that gradualism has never been scientifically supported. And it's actually the only attempt to scientifically support it was actually disproven. So we have been using gradualism to calculate these ages of these splits between hominin. For example, these archaic Homo species split from gorilla, and they say actually there's some debate that it's actually 4 million years ago. There are a lot of problems with this graph, but we're just going to use this graph to basically mention that most of these archaic Homo species were alive in the Pliocene epoch. And so they're considered non-human archaic Homo species or pan-ancestors. So they've got a few different names. But it is important to know that these are classed as non-human species. And this is also part of the argument over the definition of Homo sapien. So I do believe that it's accurate to debate that. But if we did return to Carl Linnaeus' definition, those scientists who argue that these are actually human species would be correct. And then that would also force us to go back to Carl Linnaeus' original definition of human, which did include the orangutan, gorilla, and chimpanzee. Now, Jane Goodall was quite accurate in her pointing out that gorillas and chimpanzees do have human qualities. For example, she showed that chimpanzees can start fire and do use tools. She mostly worked with chimpanzees, so that seems like an area of expertise for her. And she is correct. Historically, fairly recently, one of the justifications for separating the 4-foot mute hairy wild man from the rest of the Homo sapien population was that these guys could create fire and use tools. Well, then we found out these guys can too. So we really, there is a big push to include Homo sapiens back. Chimpanzees and gorillas back in the definition of Homo sapiens. A lot of Germans also agree with that. And I do think that is quite appropriate. And we really do see quite a transition in form in every aspect of life, both physiologically, intellectually, and in terms of their culture and morphology. So they are transitional hybrids. These are all actually transitional hybrids. So we're going to get into hybridization, and we're all probably misled in school to believe that hybrids are infertile. It turns out that is not correct. So in my biology class, I believe it was that we were taught that when a horse and a donkey breed, it creates a mule. Mules are sterile and can no longer reproduce. But that actually turns out not to be true. And that's going to take us back to George Louis Buffon. Sometime between 1707 and 1744, he accurately showed that fertility actually varies in hybrids. Now, that is the truth. That's what we should have been taught in school, but we weren't. They vary in fertility. And the probability of a successful hybrid is something like 1 in every 100,000. You're going to get like a live birth. So the first obstacle is, can the sperm penetrate the egg? The second obstacle is, can the chromosomes align harmoniously? The third obstacle is, can it survive outside of the womb? And unfortunately, a lot of species exterminate itself within 1 million years. There are very few species that survive 1 million years. But for us humans, that should actually be the goal. And we should be utilizing our environment in a way that encourages the survival of our species to last. But look at this beautiful, beautiful foal that was born to this mule. She looks quite proud, and she should be. So this is, she did a great job. I'm so proud of the Asians over there for working on this. And that just goes to show clearly hybrids are partially fertile, and that's why this entire organization is dedicated to breeding horses and donkeys. I want to congratulate them for that as well. So we're going to go on to the 6 million year old Tricholis footprint. This particular specimen is really important because it basically shows that at least a human-like species was around 6 million years ago. So we're going to have to go back to our taxonomic system, taxonomic tree here. But this is basically what the footprint looks like. I want to point out that the big toe is not opposable, as is often noted in Negroid and Mongoloid populations. They do have opposable big toes, and that's referenced in one of my books. So you can see, actually, this is a bipedal specimen, and you can see where it puts pressure on its bones, so we can determine that it's actually bipedal. And this is a really good sample because it is actually in motion, so it allowed a lot of information to be gleaned from that in this journal article, which shows that it's between 6.2 and 6.02 million years old. So really great article, very exciting finding for our taxonomic system. Oh, well, I brought this up. This came up. We're just going to talk about this now. This is Darwin's book, The Descent of Man, Race of Man. So he basically is talking about that fertility does not by itself determine a species. So that's really important because we've been led to believe that it does. But the fact that hybrids actually vary in fertility, it's not a barrier. Uh, Fertility alone does not determine the species. Actually, even the slightest sterility between the species is enough to say that it is actually a different species. And that is also in this book. I think I was trying to find that article and I didn't find it. Oh, here it is. Descent of Man, page 178, argue that fertility and sterility are not safe criterion of a specific species. And so he does say that. I'm glad I did find that article. I want to make this really big so you can actually see that these historic, and I am bringing up the people who founded science, the people who define phylogeny and the taxonomic system. So the very definitions of biology, phylogeny, nomenclature, I do think it's important to use these references, these founding fathers, whose definitions are still debated today as better definitions than what are currently in place. So very important because we have definitely been misled and in fact brainwashed to believe that fertility alone defines a species, which clearly it does not. And then also that hybrids are sterile. We've known for about 300 years that hybrids vary in fertility. So why are we taught this in school along with Christopher Columbus found America? We can just chalk that up into the other inaccurate things that we learned in school. And we're going to have to do that and move on here. So we've got a 6 million year old footprint. And the reason that's important is because homininae started about 5 million years ago. So before we have all these archaic Homo species, which I believe are transitional forms between ape and chimpanzee, and we're going to actually lay out that argument in a scientific way here today, we can see that, about 1 million years earlier, we have a human like footprint, and that footprint, it is more consistent with a Caucasian footprint. And so that's my point here. Before these transitional forms, we get a human footprint. So we're going to go ahead and move on to paternal leakage in DNA. So it's really important to recognize that at the time of the legislation that occurred to make Negroids and Mongoloids human by freeing slaves, we'll say 1860 is the beginning. And the reason I'm choosing 1860, it was around that time globally that serfdom was becoming, the serfs or slaves were basically being freed in France and various other things. So it was just after that America really saw that freeing the slaves and the serfs a little bit later, around 1860. But there was this push globally. And the reason that's important is it actually reallocates money from the individual serf or slave owner to the government through taxation. But there was a sequence of legislation to make Negroids and Mongoloids human against the science of the day. So that's basically my point, is that a lot of people say that, oh, you're making the science fit your narrative. Well, that actually appears to be what happened when they grouped all of the Negroids, Mongoloids, and Europeans together apart from the chimpanzees and gorillas from which they evolved. So that is actually saying that we are somehow the same species is actually making the science fit your narrative, because the science didn't even occur until much, much later, much later than the 1860s, for example, when the slaves were freed. So keep that in mind. We're going to touch on that later. So I'm trying to make this short. The phylogenetic network perspective on reticulate human evolution. There are many really great notes in all of these articles. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to get into all of that. This particular graph is from this article, and we're going to point out, basically, these are breeding patterns. So it turns out that the breeding patterns look more like a web than a branch. And so we have pan troglodyte, which is basically a chimpanzee. Let me actually we're going to actually zoom in on one of these. You could really zoom in on any of them. So gorilla here, pan-troglodyte, that's a chimpanzee. This is a root race. And we can see some interbreeding with Australopithecus ramidus. There's a lot of interbreeding with, so they're very closely related to gorillas and chimpanzees, basically. They bred with those guys, as well as it looks like we can see that some of these are intermediate species. So we see some branching off, some preferential interbreeding here, and then they go on to breed more selectively with their own kind. And so that's basically a hybrid. They typically occupy hybrid zones between their parents. And so we can see that Australopithecus afarensis, this is a pygmy here. It's still within the group of species that branch off from pan-troglodyte and gorilla. And in the 1930s, the Australopithecus afarensis, or pygmy, would say that the elephants would mistake them for chimpanzees. And that's just basically nature's paternity test. Even the elephants thought that they were chimpanzees. They are quite short in stature, as many of you know pygmies are. So it's Lucy. Actually, I'm going to show you a picture of that later. But these are basically preferential breeding patterns between their own kind, and they occupy hybrid zones. So that's basically the point here, is that they branched off from their ancestors and then preferentially bred with in these groups. And then here we're going to see, it's important to know that Neanderthal is not found in Negroid DNA. And so that's why they separated it over here. But we see, and this I would guess actually is more over in Asia, the Asia, Middle East area, just because of the specimen that we find over in those regions. So Homo erectus is found in Asia. We're going to get into that in a couple articles today. And there is some debate as to whether or not erectus, Asian erectus, and African erectus should even be separated. And you can see that there are grounds for that. These guys are always found very close to each other. They did occupy different geographic regions and selectively interbreed, so there may be some deviations. But I do think there's a good argument to say that they're actually the same species. And then we have Homo sapien. Yes, Homo sapien did breed with Homo ancestor, and we've got some of that, but that probably resulted from migration into the Asia region, just that their habitat had basically overlapped, probably due to migration. So Neanderthals, actually, there's evidence that Neanderthals occupied all of Asia for nearly 1 million years. So it's very interesting. We're not going to get too far into history. And so here's another web where we find Homo sapien, again, off by itself. And then these species had interbred with some of these other ones. So you can see this crossing of paths. There's some interbreeding, and then it branches off into selectively interbreeding on its own. So this is actually much more like what we see in species diversity today. For example, there are over 1,000 hybrid bird species, fish species, pretty much every plant. So Carl Linné proposed that every plant had resulted from hybridization. I had a friend whose father engineered a new plant from hybridizing them. So you take a pollen from one plant, you put it in the ovum of another plant, and then create a hybrid. And so that's basically how you create hybrids. And so we're going to get into incomplete lineage sorting. So this is important because it's basically abbreviated ILS. But incomplete lineage sorting is actually an indicator of interbreeding. And so this article, along with many other scientists, will argue that the pattern of DNA sequence variation sometimes used to support the conclusion of extensive incomplete lineage sorting within and among chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and humans is likely instead to be the result of interbreeding. And so this is a very good article. I want to make sure that we're actually referencing the sources, because some people are like, well, I don't believe you. And I understand. We were all taught wrong in school. Let's fix it and move on. And so natural hybridization in primates, one evolutionary mechanism. We're going to move on to the next article. We're we're actually going to go to this one. So this particular article, I want to make sure we mention the name of this one. The bonobo genome compared with the chimpanzee and human genome. And so we're going to actually look at a graph. Pictures say a million words, so I'm trying to fit, 300 years of science into a hopefully very short video. And so, pictures are really going to help me out there. So we're going to go ahead and blow up this particular one. So we see ILS, that's incomplete lineage sorting, and we can see European genes here, we can see African genes, and this is consistent with a lot of the archaic Homo species that we found in the area that had interbred with chimpanzees and gorillas that we saw in the previous graph. Show a branching off from chimpanzees and gorillas. So there's a very consistent scientific trail referenced by multiple scientists, including the founding fathers of science, that Negroids and Mongoloids are actually a variety of chimpanzee and gorilla. So we can see the bonobos were split from chimpanzees basically based on their culture and some minor phenotypes or visible differences. The human races, as we call it, have more differences in culture and physical features than the bonobo and gorilla. So really, we can see the inconsistency. I'm trying to highlight the inconsistency in the way that the human so-called races are treated as opposed to any other classification criteria. And Jane Goodall's right. That woman is right that we should return the chimpanzee and gorilla to the definition of human and include all of these. It's actually different hybrid states of variations of Homo sapien. There's a lot of evidence to support that. So we're going to move on to the next one. Hybridization has been a mode of evolution, has been very, very well established in species diversity for about 300 years. And multiple scientists have tried to get this into the science books and failed because an unsubstantiated scientific theory of gradualism, which has never been supported, never been evidenced in any way, over a very well-established theory of evolution, hybridization, which actually predates Darwin's theory of evolution. The reason that we're doing that can't be based on reality. It can't be based on science. It's got to be based on politics. The same politics that legislated Negroids and Mongoloids to be human against the science of the day. And because we know that we're taught non-scientific things such as hybrids are sterile and gradualism, it certainly seems that the science is not important here. The narrative is the only thing that is important, and that's why they came up with this post hoc explanation of scientific support that we're all somehow related with mitochondrial DNA in 1985 and complete replacement out of Africa around 1970. Both of those have currently been disproven, and yet we are still ignoring this hybridization as the main mode of evolution, which has been substantiated for 300 years. So clearly we can see that despite many scientists' attempts to get this into our education system, to get the facts out there, they have been silenced over time, they have been muted, and basically it goes as far as to threatening people to lose their license, their positions at universities, and various other things for mentioning these. So the human races really do not belong in any category any more than the chimpanzee belongs in the same category. So we're going into ape ethnicity and DNA comparison. So I believe this is the one that goes into comparing the X chromosome of the various different races. This is also actually a pretty good article, but this is the part that we really want to focus on. So this compared the gorilla DNA, chimpanzee DNA, and then we've got a consensus DNA. Sorry, I've got the hiccups. And then, so we've got African here shows chimpanzee DNA, and then here it shows gorilla DNA. The Native American shows chimpanzee and gorilla DNA. And, this is consistent. We've got a consistent pattern of scientific evidence here. So we've got an ape-like fossil with hints of human ancestry. Of course, they're hybrids between apes. And so we can see that this particular feature has intermediate phenotypes, so that's size and shape of things like, for example, the hands and the arms are ape-like, and the hands are remarkably like those of a human. This particular species walks with a swagger. No wonder it was found in South Africa. We can see that some Negroids also walk with a swagger. So this particular article goes over East Asians having erectus DNA. So this is one of a couple of articles. But they basically came to the conclusion that Homo erectus did not die out. That basically disproves complete replacement out of Africa, along with the Neanderthal DNA that was found in the human genome. These actually support that we have multi-regional evolution, that we have distinct and unique origins throughout evolution, that Negroids and Mongoloids actually evolved from the hybridization with chimpanzees and gorillas, and that did not happen with Europeans. They actually evolved from other Caucasian species, and perhaps there was some interbreeding with other species. I actually think that there's a lack of data on the Caucasian, where Caucasians actually did come from. So I had to actually look at some Nazi information where they used phenotype to determine origin of humans, and theirs was actually quite consistent with some of the theories of the time. Before the replacement out of Africa, there was a out of Asia hypothesis, and also multi-regional evolution. So it's really important that we point that out. So this basically says that erectus is still found in Asian populations today. And here is a book by an anthropologist who talks about erectus being among us today. So he actually puts together a very good argument for that, and I do think he's correct. So with these Asians over here, these articles would also support the findings put forth in this book by this archaeologist. And again, they're using a lot of phenotypes or size, shape, and features to define these species, and that's consistent with how we define these non-human species over here. So Homo erectus is defined as a non-human species, just like Neanderthal. But if we went back to Carl Linney's more accurate definition, in my view, then they would all be classified as varieties of Homo sapiens, just like chimpanzees and gorillas, which I think is actually quite accurate. There are a lot of Germans who argue that, I think, for a reason. And so here, we're going to get into reticulate evolution, basically, is the patterns of interbreeding between species. And so this particular study, I'm trying to make sure we're noting our sources here. So basically, we've got evidence of interbreeding between chimpanzees and some. Actually, we can conclude that it's not Homo sapien, and we can conclude that it's not Neanderthal. And this one goes into human hybridization, basically showing that some races interbred with chimpanzees and gorillas, and we've got multi-regional evolution. This is the theory which is better substantiated today. The preponderance of evidence actually supports multi-regional evolution, and that also supports a evolution from humans out of Africa, and also an evolution of humans out of Asia. But also, I do think that it's important to include chimpanzees and gorillas in the definition of Homo sapien as just a variety, because we can see this constant interbreeding pattern, which goes into practice today. And so we really have a consistent line of evidence of hybridization between Negroids, Mongoloids, and the apes that occupy those regions that span historically into modern times. And we'll have to get into that later. So this is Ernest Haeckel's book, History of Creation, Volume 2 is the one that we're on. So we're on volume 2 here. So man from narrow-nosed apes, these are human apes or anthropoids. And so then we've got human apes, gorillas and chimpanzees, and orangutans and gibbons. And there's actually quite a lot of evidence that the orangutan actually needs to have DNA comparison to other to Asians. Actually, there's quite a long line of evidence referencing some of Darwin's books and some of the books in here that indicate that there is evidence of interbreeding between mongoloids and orangutans, and as well as the gibbon. Gibbons actually have tails, and let's see if I got my article. There was one article in 1970 that was done to show that human sperm can penetrate the egg of a gibbon, and gibbons have tails. So this is actually a really important piece of evidence. So I'm going to go ahead and bring it up here. Human sperm shows an unusual affinity for the interaction of oocytes with other species. So it's basically saying the sperm can penetrate the egg of other species. Here they suggest that it's limited to Hominoidae. However, there is no evidence to suggest that it's limited to Hominoidae. There are historic accounts that have actually interbreeding with human males and other species that have been, alleged to be successful hybrid humans with other mammals. But here they do actually note that the female egg can be penetrated by other mammals. So I'm not sure. They must have been studying other mammals. This is the abstract of sperm-egg interaction, the specificity of human spermatozoa. So that's an article from the 70s. In the 70s, there was actually a lot of research done on hybridization with human hybridization. Now, I'd like to point out that is actually human chimeras are illegal. And a human chimera is basically combining human genome with other animals' genome. And that act was passed around 2021, so that we can't make human hybrids that way. But the races, it used to be illegal for the races to actually marry or interbreed. And that's very similar to this human chimera act that was passed in 2021. So we're going to go ahead and actually, I do want to mention this photograph from this book. And he is right. Ernest Haeckel actually defined biology. He defined phylogeny. So he's one of the founding fathers in science. So I do think it's really important that we refer back to him when we're talking about the definition of Homo sapien and some of the debate as to how that should actually be defined. So here, let's see, orangutans and gibbons in Asia, orangutans and chimpanzees in Africa. So he's talking about them being, narrow-nosed apes. Similarities in their brain and skull. And then he calls them ape-like men versus men-like ape, which is similar to the definition of anthropoid. So he's saying they originated out of man-like apes or anthropoids. So he's suggesting, and this is actually consistent with the line of evidence I'm showing you today, but Ernest Haeckel, who defined biology and phylogeny in 1880, noticed that Negroids and Mongoloids probably evolved from gorillas, orangutans, and chimpanzees from Africa. And so, 1880, all he had to look at was basically nature's paternity test, but we have confirmation that his idea was correct today. So nothing to sneeze at here. This is hard science, unlike some of the things that we are publishing today. So just wanted to point that out. And then we're going to move on to some of the consequences of hybridization. So this is a pretty good article. I really like this one. It summarized very concisely some of the major concerns with hybridization. Hybrids reveal barriers to successful mating. Some of the most important part of this article that I'm going to point out is that it took generations of interbreeding to doom some hybrids. So basically they're saying after crossbreeding, let's get back to the mule picture. The mule, so we've got the horse and the donkey created this F1 offspring. That's the mule. And the female mules are partially fertile. They're more fertile than their male counterparts. So I do want to point that out. So she's F1. And then you back cross her with either a horse or a donkey to get the F2 population. And so that is the foal that she gave birth to, this beautiful foal. I just love the look on her face. So she is the F2 generation. And then what you would do, and I'm sure these Asians know this, is back cross this with one of the parent species, the horse or the donkey. And so she's got increased fertility compared to her mother. And then her offspring, after back crossing it with a horse or a mule, and one of those, the horse or the donkey, one of those will increase fertility more. So you should find that either mating it with a horse or mating it with a mule will increase fertility more than the other pair. And so the third, the F3 generation should increase fertility for both, males and females. Actually, the F2 generation should have partial fertility for the males as well. And then domesticating animals can also increase fertility. So there are very well established farming techniques that have been known for hundreds of years that are used for hybridizing animals, including plants and all kinds of things, like even viruses hybridize to change into new species of virus. So it should be actually quite obvious that hybridization is the major mode of evolution, down to a microscopic level. Let's look at mitochondria. Actually, I'm really excited about the mitochondria. And so we can see hybridization is theorized even on a microscopic level. So we've got the creation of a tiny little organism called mitochondria here, and how elements actually work together with ultraviolet light, infrared light, and visible light spectrums to actually hybridize. And we see cells responding to these sorts of variables in the environment all the time. So it shouldn't be actually a surprise at all. So then we're going to get into, remember that hybrids vary in fertility. And so we're getting into the fact that Negroids, now this has been shown in many studies, Negroids or blacks have lower sperm concentration, and Mongoloids have been shown to have lower sperm motility. So this is according to the article here. Let's turn it so you can see. But there are actually quite a lot of articles that come to the same conclusion here. And so chromosomal disorders, no surprise for a hybrid, would also be at substantially higher rates in their hybrid offspring. And we can see that Negroids actually have 20% higher chromosomal disorders that result in miscarriage. Negroids actually have the highest rate of miscarriage, but Mongoloids also do have high rates of miscarriage. I know in Asia, in China, they have artificially altered some of their data. For example, as a result of practicing eugenics or one or two child laws, that is a form of eugenics and infanticide. They have decreased their birth rate, but that's because of the laws. Historically, before Mao China, they actually had patterns quite consistent with Negroid populations, which you would expect given they have similar origins. And so it was, six kids per woman, and then the mortality rates were extremely high and still are high in some parts of China. So the historic data is quite consistent. And I also do want to actually touch on some of this information. So here we've got the IQ by population. So we can see, generally speaking, below the equator, most populations did have quite a low IQ. Australia Aborigines actually do have an IQ of 65. This is their new IQ with all of their Caucasian individuals who are living in their, these regions were colonized by various groups of Caucasian individuals or European individuals. But their natural IQ in South America is somewhere like 75, 65, 85, and you can see a general pattern of it increasing in regions where there are more Europeans. And actually you can see that too, where there are areas where there are more Europeans occupying these regions as a result of colonization. You do see an increased IQ, but if you were to take the general population, not a lot of Caucasians live in this region. If you were to take their natural population, you would see a trend, and you kind of see it here, of gradually increasing IQ as they hybridize at higher rates with Caucasian DNA. And then this little outlier here, I do want to talk about that because Mongoloids, the etiology of the word Mongoloid, and we have Mongolia here named after this root word. Mong originates from mixed. And so Mongolism was actually the word for Down syndrome. And so we have a group of people who were historically identified as mixed race, basically mentally retarded people or people with Down syndrome. who now, weird, they're like the smartest people in the world. And that's all after communism, stealing intellectual property, and they have a plethora of organs from unidentified donors. So they're one of the world's biggest organ donors here, and so they can't identify their donor populations, which are actually quite likely prisoners, which I don't know if you know anything about communism, but it might be something to look into. We're not going to get into that here. So Down syndrome in Africa, there has been some evidence of increased rates of Down syndrome occurring in Africa. Now, I do want to point out that let's take a look at the screening criteria for Down syndrome. So this is the screening criteria for Down syndrome: a short, flat face. These used to be called Mongolian folds. They were changed to the name epicanthic folds because they really want to obscure the origin of the word Down syndrome as having originated from mixed race or hybridized species. And it's also important to note that Negroids, when they do have Down syndrome, do not have some of the traits that are found in Caucasians in the screening criteria, in fact, for Down syndrome, such as neck fat and a thick tongue. So remember that Negroids do not have the features of a thick tongue and neck fat, which are part of the screening criteria when they do have Down syndrome. So that makes Negroids substantially harder to diagnose, especially when other features in Down syndrome are naturally seen in about 70% of their population, namely a flattened nose bridge, short, flat face, upslanted palpable fissures, excuse me. So that's the upslanted eyes, and the downslanted eyes correlates with a different haplotype called hypertrichosis. And so both of those actually do share quite a lot of Down syndrome features, which are naturally seen in pretty much all Asian populations, which is why Asians were called Mongoloids, and the country Mongolia was named after these features of Down syndrome. Mongolism, remember, Mongolism was the previous word for Down syndrome, and that was changed to retardation and then changed again. So we just keep trying to, and it's just like the phylogenetic system of Homo sapien. We see layers and layers of different definitions, and almost to obscure people from finding what was really going on scientifically. But when you look at the etiology of the word, it becomes a lot easier to understand. So next we're going to look at hypertrichosis. Hypertrichosis is a different haplotype. So we can see here that hypertrichosis is basically hair all over your body, but some of these are actually mentioned as symptoms of hybridization, such as mongoloid spots. These are basically I hate to say birth defect because it's actually genetic. These birth defects are actually passed on, and we have mosaics are basically where one of their cells carries different DNA than the rest of their body, and that can happen in gametes such as sperm or ovum, so that these features, sometimes they don't manifest at all, sometimes they manifest later on in life. And so there are all kinds of things that can happen with chromosomal disorders. But I just wanted to point out some of the similarities, a lack of a nasal bridge here. Facial grimace is another feature of hypertrichosis. We've got the saddle nose. That's basically where the nostrils flare up like that, and the little tip of their nose is pretty much flat with the flares of the nostrils, and so it's pretty. And we see this in a lot of Negroid and also South American populations. This particular individual here, Julia Pastrana. Now these individuals are actually all frequently touted as the missing links in freak shows in the 19th and 20th century. And so while we were legislating them human, they were actually still kept in zoos. They were still touted as the missing link in freak shows in the 19th and 20th century, while at the same time they were being legislated to have the right to vote. They were being legislated to be treated as human and have human rights. So it was against the science of the day. That narrative started before any science was even created. So here, This article is actually a really good article. The article talks about the frequency of Down syndrome. There are some science indicates that Down syndrome occurs at higher rates in Negroid populations and may result from interbreeding between populations, which actually is in line with the very definition of Mongolism from the root word. When you look at the etiology of the word Mongolism, you see that there's not only did scientists say that it resulted from interbreeding with Asians or Africans, but actually the root word indicates that interbreeding was the cause of Mongolism. And we know that actually mosaic Down syndrome and translocation Down syndrome have a genetic root. And the third cause of Down syndrome is unknown. However, they like to say that, oh, there's no indication that it's genetic. Oh, wait, hold on a minute. 2 out of 3 causes are known to be genetic. You can't say that something is not genetic if the cause is unknown, and especially when 2 out of 3 other causes of Down syndrome are known to be genetic. And the etiology of the word Down syndrome implies that it's in fact genetic. So there does seem to be more evidence that it is in fact genetic, and there is evidence that it results from hybridization. So this article also goes into the fact that, Negroids don't have some of these features of Down syndrome when they do have Down syndrome, and that 70% of normal Africans actually have the features of Down syndrome. So that also makes the screening criteria for Down syndrome, which is used to recommend further testing of Down syndrome. So for example, they use those phenotypes, these phenotypes to determine if somebody should get DNA tested for Down syndrome. But if this is invalid, which it is, it's invalid when you have a population who has nearly all of the features of Down syndrome. You can no longer use the screening criteria to recommend genetic testing. You have to actually genetically test them at random to get an accurate percentage of the Down syndrome rates in that population. So that suggests that we do not have good numbers of Down syndrome among Negroid or Mongoloid populations. So this article is basically ethnicity and miscarriage. And we're going to move down. Black women and Asian women have increased risk of miscarriage. And then the next article, this article shows that Asians with white male fathers, their vaginal canal is too small for the baby's head, so they end up having cesarean sections. The same thing is true with Negroid populations as well, for the same reasons. And their vaginal canal is just generally smaller. And then we're going to go on to this is The Origin of New Forms of Life by Eugene McCarthy. He's a really great evolutionary biologist, and he basically created this page, Macroevolution. So this page goes through all of the alleged hybrids historically into today. And so I did get some of my information of human hybrids from this page, but you can see actually this guy, I think he's a really intelligent man, and he is also somebody who's fighting for getting hybridization into the mainstream education. Really great website. It goes into some of these hybrids between sheep and pigs. There's a special name for it. It originated in Russia, I believe. But really cool article. It's not exclusive to the human population. Plants hybridize all the time. The flowers in your garden are probably hybrid plants as well. So this is a really good book about hybridization and the limits of hybridization, actually. Well, I was trying to find the part of this book that talks about how gradualism was not substantiated whatsoever. Gradualism was actually disproven. But he basically goes through gradualism to see where, why do we get stuck on gradualism when there's no scientific support for gradualism? And he actually thinks that it's a religious purpose. But I don't think that it's religious, because actually hybridization fits biblical text much, much better. The sons of God came into the daughters of man is in Genesis. And so that's actually a reference to hybridization. So I don't think it has anything to do with religion. I don't think it has anything to do with science. So it's been 300 years since we've known hybrids are vary in fertility. But basically, he goes into the only proposed explanation for gradualism was basically disproven, and that gradualism has actually never had any scientific support. And it's never had any scientific support whatsoever. And so this particular book is very interesting due to its disproving gradualism as a mode of evolution, basically. But let's go into the legislative aspect of making Negroids and Mongoloids human species. And so in this article, Paul Franklin did an amazing job on this article. I actually think this is a very concise explanation for the laws and why those laws changed. And we can see, I just want to point out that the Constitution was written, he says 1789, and that the Naturalization Act was passed. So this is the lens for which we should see how the Constitution was meant to be applied. Every free white person shall be a citizen when they live in America for 2 years is basically what that act says. So shortly after the Constitution was passed, we can see the fathers of the Constitution meant for it to be applied to Aryans, basically. Because there was very little mixed blood at the time. It wasn't until 1960 that the RH vaccine, which was named after a rhesus monkey, I might add, the RH vaccine was created to stop the antibody in the woman's body from attacking and killing the fetus from another species. And so that would be an RH positive fetus. And so that was a biological barrier to reproducing with other races. So the Caucasian race, the female, if a female were impregnated by an RH positive father, it would kill the offspring. And so that prevented reproduction between the races, as well as the female Asian and the Negroid female, their vaginal canal is so small that they would typically have died while giving birth. So that is another biological barrier between the races being able to breed. And so, you know, these are nothing to sneeze at. These are biological barriers to hybridization. And when we remove those barriers, there are serious consequences, as in possibly exterminating the hybrids. And so, yes, although it may be fun and exciting to create hybrid species, hybrid originates from the word hybris, and hybris is much like narcissistic traits, basically. Maybe people are aware of those. That is where you basically put yourself above your family, above your community, above your nation, and above God. And anytime you challenge or defy God, it incites retribution or nemesis, the one who will punish you. Now that can come from God, your own people, your family, or your community. And when you create a new species, you are challenging God. You're saying, I know better to create this species which did not previously exist in the world. And that nemesis comes when God exterminates that species, or that species exterminates itself based on natural laws. And so it's very important to work with nature rather than write your own story of how nature should be, because the end result is that those natural laws will exterminate those species which God did not create, which man through its own self-aggrandizement created a new hybrid species which will likely not survive. And we know that actually some of these species are not likely to survive. So historically speaking, the mulatto, or half black, half white, are typically killed by the pure blacks. Historically speaking, we can see numerous tales of that, not only in Africa, but also in Haiti and various other places on the world. And we can see that today, actually, in these war-torn hybrid zones of the Middle East, for example. They don't get along with each other very well. Even those minor changes in instincts between the various percentages of Aryan blood create huge conflict in these regions. Also, this is the conflict that we see all over the world, and these are actually normal conflicts that every species in the ecosystem faces. And natural law is to allow the dominant species to eliminate the weaker species, and that's how natural law works. So humans have intervened basically with selective species, namely Negroids and Mongoloids, to encourage their survival, or their hybrids in the Middle East, namely, to survive by basically supplying them with resources that they never evolved to have themselves. Remember, all of these populations of Negroids and Mongoloids survived for free, living off of nature. They never had capitalism. They never had goods. They had tribalism. And so they have used those technologies to basically destroy the means for which they have to live. So it's to no avail to them. You are not actually helping them. You are helping them destroy themselves by sharing our technology. And we are actually destroying each other by sharing our habitat. And there are all kinds of biological problems with that, including the fact that we are actually resistant to or more prone to certain diseases and contract those diseases to others in the population. So not only could we be sterilizing ourselves, but we could actually be spreading contagious diseases at substantially high rates just from interbreeding. Actually, having a farm increased contagious diseases to populations. Anyway, we're not going to go too far into that. This particular article talks about the survival of mankind, and they do talk about hybridization in this article, but it goes to show the inevitable destiny of all life on this planet Earth is to be engulfed by the sun. We've got the children of Noah racing to populate other planets, Noah's Ark, colonizing other planets and spreading life to other planets, which is, our only other option besides our demise, to colonize other planets. So actually, every life on this planet should support the Aryan race efforts to colonize other planets, and in doing so have the self-preservation to save your own people as well. And I think that we have an obligation to do that for the pygmies, who have been around for 3.2 million years. For the Aryan species, I do believe there are different species of Aryans and Asians as well. And we can see that through the taxonomic system. They're actually classified as different species. But this goes through some of the features. You can see the toes of this particular species. Negroids and Mongoloids also have opposable big toes, which they use much like hands, or at least they used to, in their natural habitat. So this is an incredible article that talks about hybridization and the three races, or more species. And so it talks about some of these obstacles that we face. Actually, all of the obstacles that could doom the human race would be eliminated by returning the hybrids to their hybrid zones, such as Mongoloids, to actually, I think that all of Asia used to be a Caucasian territory, which is why England tried to recolonize India. Anyway, we can see that in the terracotta statues, this army of Asians, and behind that we see a carriage, much like you find in Europe. And I think those are a couple thousand years old. Anyway, great article. I'm going to go ahead and stop it there so I don't get completely distracted. I do want to encourage people to do the things that they can, namely, you can have people sign a bill to be sent to legislature to be passed by legislature. You can join your legislature, which is held monthly in your state typically, you could write your state representatives saying that there's no difference between males and females. I mean, that's the foundation of our survival. So into today, we've got the 12-year-old Angola boy who his mother says that his deceased mother said that he is the offspring of a chimpanzee love affair in the Gazetta National Park. It turns out that sexual relationships between humans and chimpanzees is fairly common. So the probability of having a successful offspring is like 1 in 100,000. So they really are having an awful lot of sex. And so one of the variables between it being a viable offspring is the amount of backcrossing with that parent species. So my guess is that that population over in Angola is actually probably more closely related to the chimpanzee, which is why perhaps it had a better probability of having a successful offspring with the chimpanzee. Had it been a Negroid who'd backcrossed with the Caucasian population here in America so many times, I think they have like something like 70% Irish DNA or something, I would propose that that particular Negroid individual would have a harder time breeding with a chimpanzee than one of these populations who lived next to this park in Angola, which successfully bred an offspring. So really, there are a bunch of variables, including genetic similarity to offspring, to the parent populations that are breeding to create an offspring. And then I want to take you to the orangutan. So there's such a thing as preferential interbreeding, which we actually saw with the Angola boy in the other article. So this particular one is about the prostitute orangutan. We're going to take you back to the IQ of the Negroid and Mongoloid in many, many countries, and Australian Aborigines actually have IQs that are quite consistent with these other primates. So really, they are intelligent. They're beautiful creatures, and I really don't think that there's any there should be any problem whatsoever. I believe that I evolved from chimpanzees for like 20 years of my life, so I really don't see what the big deal is. But this beautiful orangutan was rescued from prostitution in Indonesia. So in Indonesia, they were prostituting her, and the possibility, now we have not compared the orangutan DNA to Asians, but there are many indications, including actually this would be an indication of preferential interbreeding with a parent species. There are many other indications as well that would suggest that Mongoloids, this is one of their parent species. And so we actually really do need to compare the DNA between the orangutan and the Asian, and Asians, actually, there are a lot of other indications, like they have less twinning rates, like Mongoloids. They have the similar gestation time as Mongoloids. And so there are a lot of other indications that Mongoloids are actually an intermediate orangutan human, and possibly also chimpanzee hybrid. It may actually depend on the population of Asian over there that you're comparing the genome to, as to how much chimpanzee or orangutan DNA that they have. But I haven't actually seen any data on that. But we can see here that there's a continuous pattern of interbreeding today with the orangutan and also the chimpanzee. And this article goes into many more examples than I'm going to be able to fit in about an hour. But it goes through historic accounts of alleged hybrids into today. And I like looking at the phenotypes. The phenotypes is a valid test for parent determining the parents. And then I like having that DNA confirmation, which I provided today. But that sort of makes it conclusive when you have the phenotypes and then the DNA analysis, which shows a pattern of interbreeding and also shared habitat. These are the factors that you would look at to indicate indicate confirmation of a hybrid species. Habitat, shared culture, shared instincts, shared features, a shared DNA, which we consistently find with the Negroid populations and actually a variety of other species. So if you want to look into that, I'm going to refer you to Eugene McCarthy's webpage, macroevolution.net. Macro basically means on a visible level that you can see with your eyes. And I think we can all actually really see hybridization in action in our environment, in our gardens, and various aspects of life. So it's unfortunate that this information was hidden from people for 300 years. Remember, instead of that, we have been teaching an unsupported, unproven theory of gradualism instead. So clearly it has nothing to do with science. It has to do with the mainstream narrative having been pushed over the last 100 years. And then the scientific evidence, supposed scientific evidence, was created in 1970 with replacement out of Africa, which has now been disproven. And we know that some of these populations evolved from ape species. So it really is quite impossible for us to be to have the same origin. And that's actually pretty conclusive here. So it's a real mystery why we're continuing with this post hoc explanation that came after the legislation over the last 160 years or so. And then gradualism, which has never been supported. And despite replacement out of Africa being disproven and mitochondrial DNA also being disproven, it's a real mystery why we continue with these narratives that have no scientific support. And so here's the article, Paternal Leakage of Mitochondrial DNA into the offspring. So this article is one of many articles that has actually shown that mitochondria is not just passed down through the mother, that there are these rare circumstances where it is actually passed on through mutations or paternal leakage from the father, basically those sorts of things. So I'm going to go ahead and end it there.